All right, hello and welcome to Honey Badger Radio. What number is this? 78, I think it is. Jordan Peterson. Oh, 79, I'm sorry.
No, 48.
Shut up.
Fireside Chat, 48.
Okay, no, I think it's 69.
No,
right?
it's 79.
Six,
we got
six.
this. We are talking today with Jordan Peterson. And I want to thank you for taking the time to join us on Honey Badger Radio, Jordan. Thank you.
My pleasure.
He is a tenured professor of psychology at the University of Toronto. He is at the center of a huge controversy at the moment over his opposition to Bill C-16, which inserts gender identity and gender expression into Canada's Human Rights Act and Criminal Code. Since making his objections to Bill C-16 public via his YouTube channel, he has garnered as much support from the public as condemnation. But one thing is certain, this is one interesting guy, and we have him here for a full hour. So, I guess without further ado, let's get to know Mr. Peterson and what he does. So I'm going to hand the floor to Allison.
Yeah, okay. Well, the first question that I have for you, Jordan, is could you explain a bit more about Bill C-16 and the implications for free speech on campus?
Well, Bill C-16 purports only to add gender identity and gender expression to the list of protected groups under the Canadian Human Rights Act, and also to make discrimination and harassment predicated on those two categories part of pursuable under the hate speech provisions of the Criminal Code. And that seems somewhat innocuous, although less so than might be imagined on first examination, say in no small part because gender expression isn't a protected group by any stretch of the imagination. Gender expression is how you choose to manifest your gender in clothing, dress, and hair style and makeup. And I'm not making this up. That's precisely the terminology that's applied to the bill. In the surrounding policy documents that are most easily accessible at the Ontario Human Rights Commission and the Justice Department at the federal level have said already that Bill C-16 will be interpreted in keeping with the policies that the Ontario Human Rights Commission has already established. And so the manner in which you choose your fashion is now protected category under the Canadian Human Rights Act and the Criminal Code, which is of course completely absurd. And then the gender identity issue is also very problematic because if you look at how gender identity is defined, again in the Ontario Human Rights Commission website, it's a purely subjective definition of identity. And so human identity now, as far as our legal system is concerned, both at the federal and the provincial level, is something that's completely divorced from the underlying biology. So there's no biological influence allowed anymore on your identity. And it's also even completely dissociated from any social influence, because, you could imagine that your identity is the consequence of two forces, taking the individual out of the argument for a minute: your biological substrate and your socio-cultural surroundings. And you can argue lucidly, generally speaking, that identity has a biological element, and you can argue lucidly that it has a socio-cultural element, and then you can debate about the degree to which each of those things influences a given element of identity. And that would be the argument, say, between the biologists and the evolutionary biologists, evolutionary psychologists, and so on the biological end, and then the more social constructionists, social scientists, and humanities types on the social end. But the legislation goes even farther than the social constructionists, who would argue that your identity is only a consequence of socialization. It says your identity is essentially nothing but your subjective choice moment to moment, and refuses to include the possibility of social negotiation or biological substrate underneath that. And it's the most puerile and narrow-minded and shallow conception of human identity that you could possibly imagine, and now it's instantiated as a necessary belief according to our legal establishment. So it's unbelievable that it's happened. I can't believe that it's happened, and it's hard for people to understand why it's significant, because the bill looks merely like it's something good for an oppressed minority, at a casual glance. And then to understand what the bill really means, you have to look at the Ontario Human Rights Commission website, and then you have to understand the philosophy that's being instantiated in the legislation. But basically, the philosophy is that there's no such thing as objective reality. There's no such thing as social reality. Your identity is whatever you want it to be from moment to moment. And if anybody dares challenge that, then they're engaging in a hate crime. And, well, I just can't believe that that's the case. I can't believe that that's happened, but it has.
Have you seen any of the negative effects of this law on college campuses yet?
Well, I've seen negative effects of the doctrines within which the law are embedded. I mean, for example, my graduate students, I'm a personality psychologist, and one of the things that personality psychologists actually study is sex differences in personality, which are very large, by the way, and which are also larger in the Scandinavian countries, where the most steps have been taken to flatten out the sociological landscape for men and women. The biological differences in personality between men and women are larger there now than anywhere else in the world. And that's very well documented. It's not a matter of opinion. It's a very well documented scientific fact. And teaching anything about the relationship between biology and identity, and which is a very broad category, has become problematic for people. My graduate students talk frequently about being uncomfortable bringing up such issues in class because they're afraid of a potential backlash. And that sort of chilling effect is very awful because, when I'm deciding to lecture, there's hundreds of things that I can lecture about. And it's very easy to choose less controversial topics. I mean, maybe just don't have the heart for it that day, to go after a topic that's going to result in a fair bit of negative attention being directed your way. Or even talking to a classroom that's got an odd chill in it because people are uncomfortable with what you're saying. And it's difficult. And so what happens is that this sort of political pressure has overt effects in that people can be punished outright for their views, but it has even worse subversive chilling effects. So, I mean, for example, I was in a debate at the university a couple of weeks ago with a couple of politically correct authoritarian types, a lawyer and a professor from the University of British Columbia, and the professor had indicated prior to the debate that she wanted to be described using they pronouns, and I have a hard time keeping track of people's names. So during the debate, I actually had my phone open so that I could remember the moderator's name and the lawyer's name and this professor's name. And during the debate, I referred to the professor twice as she, and there was a chill in the audience right away. And I mean, she had a number of supporters in the audience, and it took me aback because I am by nature a relatively polite person, and so I'm inclined to politely accede to people's requests when they're reasonable, or maybe when they're even unreasonable. But I was having a very difficult time keeping track of who was who, apart from also having to keep track of the pronouns. But what was interesting to me was that instant chill. I had transgressed against a new social norm, and it's the sort of thing that poisons dialogue, because it put me immediately in a kind of moral. I was morally at fault immediately for something that was, well, it was a habitual response, right? I mean, I'm pretty much accustomed to referring to people who look like females as she, and I don't think that there's anything particularly reprehensible about that. And I certainly don't believe that calling people by the pronouns they choose is a mark of respect. I think that's a specious and narcissistic argument. Specious, narcissistic, and manipulative argument that has no basis in fact.
Okay, if I can interject, I'm actually going to take this a little bit off the rails at the moment, and put forth something that I've been recently watching Jonathan Haidt. And he says that libertarians and other people have a lower disgust response than liberals. And now if you look at disgust as a way of mediating human behavior, it's based on social censure and the threat of being removed from the group. Could this be, because really what you're talking about in your scenario, what you experienced, was a disgust-based social interaction. In other words, you have to abide.
Well, one of the things that we found, because we've looked at political correctness in the same way that Jonathan Haidt has, pursuing research using the same methodology, and we developed a questionnaire for assessing the degree to which someone is politically correct, that was originally derived from 200 items. And what we found was that there were two forms of political correctness. There was liberal political correctness, which is a hybrid between obviously classical liberal beliefs and politically correct beliefs. And then there was a more pernicious kind of politically correct belief, which was PC authoritarianism, or we described as PC authoritarianism. And the PC authoritarians were high in disgust sensitivity and orderliness. And so you see the proclivity towards fundamentalism, or the proclivity towards totalitarianism in a belief system, seems to be motivated in part by a trait known as orderliness, which is part of Big Five conscientiousness. Conscientious people make good managers and administrators and tend to be more conservative. But conscientiousness breaks down into industriousness and orderliness. And orderliness seems to be the predictor of the proclivity towards authoritarianism, whether on the right or the left, because right-wingers, radical right-wingers, are also disgust sensitive, and so are the PC authoritarians. The difference between the left-wing authoritarians and the right-wing authoritarians seems to be that the left-wing authoritarians are also high, paradoxically enough, in a trait called agreeableness. And agreeableness is a maternal trait. So if you're agreeable, you're compassionate, primarily. You're also polite and compassionate. And you might say, well, the social justice warriors are neither polite nor compassionate, but you have to understand it as an offshoot of maternal behavior. And so if you're viewing the world through a maternal lens, then it falls into two categories: vulnerable infants and evil predators. And as long as you're in the vulnerable infant category, then you get the compassion and the politeness. But if you're in the evil predator category, then you better watch the hell out, because there's nothing more angry than a mother bear protecting her cubs. And so it's quite comical. I was talking to my brother-in-law this weekend, who's a very astute person, and we were talking about sex-typed behavior in the political landscape. And all these social justice warrior types, most of whom happen to be female, have no idea that they're acting out the most stereotypical female behaviors in their political pursuits, because they're dividing the world into predator and infant, and then agitating consistently on the side of the infant against the predator. So, and that's the other thing that drives the political correct authoritarians, along with orderliness. And
yeah, oh, sorry.
Yeah, oh, that's fine.
Oh, I just wanted to point out that this, as you said, it's a conscientiousness, but they're high in disgust sensitivity. Yeah. So I would actually theorize that because they have this high disgust sensitivity, they are actually capable of doing something. And no intended insult to you or even myself, because I can't do this. I make mistakes with pronouns all the time, and it's because I can't. It's hard for me to navigate those disgust-based social systems, because I'm a very my thinking is very rational, very logical, very regimented, and.
Yeah.
When you put me in a situation like that, I could see myself making exactly the same mistakes you did.
Oh, the situation is actually set up to ensure that people will make mistakes, because that provides an opportunity for what people have been calling virtue signaling, right? It's like it's a great game if you can skew it so that your interlocutor or your opponent is constantly making moral errors, because then you can. That's just more evidence that they're evil predators, and that you're on the side of all that's holy and good.
Yes, exactly. But I would posit or propose that people who are disgust-based thinkers, who are high in disgust sensitivity, can navigate these social situations far better than individuals such as yourself and myself, and perhaps the other people who are involved in Honey Badger Radio, and even the people who listen, because we have to step through all kinds of additional information, whereas they use this sort of disgust filter to filter through a whole bunch of information really quickly.
That's certainly possible. Yeah, that's certainly possible. I mean, a lot of ideological proclivity is temperamental shorthand, because people tend to vote and think their temperaments. And that's a very important, that's part of the reason why Jonathan Haidt's work is so important, is because it's bringing to light the realization that political belief is actually a reflection of an underlying, well, comically enough, it's actually a reflection of an underlying biological proclivity. And that people who are at different poles of the political spectrum are different sorts of people. So, for example, liberals are high in trait openness, and openness is basically the creativity slash interest in ideas dimension of the Big Five. The Big Five is the classic comprehensive personality model. And so liberal people tend to be high in openness and in interest in ideas. And so they like fiction and they like art and they like movies, and their thinking tends to be associative. One idea will trigger off a bunch of other ideas. But they also tend to be low in conscientiousness. And then the classic conservative is someone who's high in conscientiousness, so they're industrious and orderly, dutiful, somewhat judgmental. They're judgmental with regards to moral transgressions frequently, and they're low in openness. And so and I think the fundamental axis, the reason for that, because I've wondered, well, why do openness and conscientiousness clump together to make up the major political dimension? And here's what I think it is, and I think this is a really exciting idea, is that the fundamental political difference between people is how open they think borders should be. And it's not just borders between countries, it's borders at every level. And so conservative people think that sexual borders should be fairly high and well fortified, and that conceptual barriers should be high and well fortified, and that there's a place for everything and everything should stay in its place. And liberals, and that's both low openness and high orderliness that's driving that. And liberals say, no, we need to have the borders open so there can be a free flow of ideas. And that the danger that's associated with open borders, and that is that everything will fall apart, is trumped by the advantage, which is the free flow of information. And the truth of the matter is that you can't tell how open the borders should be. Sometimes they should be more open than they are, and sometimes they should be more closed than they are. And the way you figure that out is by having a dialogue between the liberals and the conservatives. And the democratic process is actually that process of dialogue, of endless dialogue, because it's not like one temperamental type is correct and the other temperamental type is wrong. They just represent different points on a continuum, and at different points in time, the appropriate solution is to be found at different points on the continuum. And so that's why the dialogue is so important.
Earlier in response to one of the questions, you mentioned that the more authoritarian conservatives and the social justice warriors are actually similar in their level or their response, their disgust, their sensitivity to disgust.
It's disgust sensitivity that seems to be driving at least part of the authoritarian proclivity. When I was sorting this out, I was reading Hitler's Table Talk, and it was a very interesting book. It was derived from transcripts of Hitler's spontaneous dinnertime utterances from 1939 to 1942. And so you get a sense of exactly how it was that he thought and spoke. And the classic idea with regards to fascists is that they're somehow afraid of people with worldviews that are different than theirs. And that's often been used in the social science literature as an explanation for conservative belief, that conservatives are somehow more fearful and they put more strict boundaries around things to protect themselves from fear. But that doesn't seem to be correct. What seems to be correct is that the totalitarian types are much more disgust sensitive, and that it's not that easy to dissociate disgust from fear, because you fear most things that you're disgusted by, so that the emotions get contaminated. And even in the field of psychopathology, obsessive compulsive disorder, for example, which is associated with contamination fears and hand washing and that kind of thing, has often been classified as an anxiety disorder, because when people are exposed to a contaminant, they look afraid, but really what's happened is that they've become disgusted and they're trying to clean themselves. And anyways, Hitler's general parlance was, and I saw this through new eyes because of the research we'd been doing, was he's unbelievably disgust sensitive. And so Hitler had a metaphor that governed his political thinking. And the metaphor was that the Aryan race was a body, and the body was pure. And that's the pure blood idea. You see that echoed in modern myths like Harry Potter, with the pure blood idea. But anyways, that the Aryan race was a body, and that it was a pure body, and it was under assault from parasites. And that's disgust language, contamination language. And the parasites were all the people that the Nazis went after, but roughly speaking, anyone who wasn't Aryan in their blood. And all of what Hitler did was associated with the removal of contaminants. And I think that's partly why he was also so obsessed with fire, as part of his, because the Nazi movement was very dramatic. They used a lot of bright lights and nighttime ceremonies and fire. And I mean, he kind of viewed the demolition of Berlin at the end, because the Germans had failed, as their deserved right of purification. But you see, Hitler started his purification processes, let's call them that, by cleaning up the Nazi factories. He started actually with an anti-tuberculosis campaign, and then he moved to cleaning up the factories. And cleaning up the factories meant literally cleaning them, and planting flowers in front of them and beautifying them, but also getting rid of the bugs and the rodents. And the chemical that they used to get rid of the bugs and the rodents was Zyklon B. And that was eventually used in the Auschwitz, that was eventually used in the concentration camps. But it started with getting rid of parasites, insects and rats. And then they started cleaning out the mental hospitals. And, then they moved on to the Jews and the Gypsies. And it was all disgust related by the looks of things. And Hitler was also a real admirer of willpower, and that goes along with that orderliness and conscientiousness. Like, he was very proud of the fact that he could keep his arm outstretched in front of him for 8 hours a day. And he bathed 4 times a day as well. So
yeah,
he was a very fastidious person.
Didn't he spearhead anti-smoking campaigns, and he was like a vegetarian?
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
absolutely. There was, and that's, Haidt talks about that with regards to conservatives as being at least in part motivated by purity concerns. And look, I mean, that really is a scientific idea.
He also Jonathan Haidt said that liberals do have their own purity concerns in terms of what gets put in their body, and they're not so much concerned about sexual promiscuity and another person in someone else's body, but the food, so
yeah, well, that's still being sorted out, because it does look like there are different categories of disgust. There's moral disgust and animal remainder disgust and sexual disgust and moral disgust, and the similarity between those and the differences we're still sorting out. I mean, Haidt did a lot of the original work, even establishing disgust as a valid domain of inquiry for psychologists. It's really profound work, I would say. And the fact that it has, like, the idea that authoritarianism is motivated primarily by disgust, like, that's a revolutionary idea. It really is, because it puts, especially because social scientists have been associating authoritarianism with anxiety. And the problem with that is that if you look at conservatives, because most studies of authoritarianism have been done with the far right, right? If you look at conservatives, they actually are less anxious than liberals. They're less neurotic from a trait perspective. And so the idea that they're conservative and closed in their thinking because they're afraid doesn't really seem to withstand empirical evaluation. But the disgust idea, that's a whole different kettle of fish. And it really sheds a light on authoritarian concerns. And the PC authoritarian types, who are orderly and disgust sensitive, who also have a higher incidence of psychiatric disorders as well, especially anxiety and depressive disorders, they're also less intelligent verbally, and more likely to show signs of personality disorder symptoms. They're also unbelievably committed to censorship. And when we broke the politically correct viewpoints down into 2 categories, we did that statistically. The PC liberal types are pretty much concerned with equality. That's equality and fairness, let's say, for whatever that means. And what it means is that you should treat everybody like they're members of your close family. That would be the biological analog. But the PC authoritarians are unbelievably censorious. Like, they want to exercise control over language at every level of analysis. They don't want anything that's offensive, and that's the disgust sensitivity, right? They don't want anything that's offensive to be said by anyone.
They don't want anything that's impure.
Yeah.
So it sounds like, just listening to your anecdote about Hitler, it's almost like the PC authoritarians, they want to remove the racists, or what they allege are the racists, the bigots, the sexists, the transphobics, the homophobes. They want to try to purge society of this impurity, of this sin, this vileness.
Yeah. That's exactly it. There's no doubt about that. And the thing is that if you combine that with we talked earlier about the idea of agreeableness as a maternal dimension. And so agreeable people are conflict averse, strangely enough. They like to maintain peace, but you got to think about it as a maternal dimension. And women, by the way, are higher in agreeableness by a substantial they're substantially higher than men in agreeableness. And that's worldwide. And again, the differences are biggest in the most egalitarian societies. And so, men are quite maternal for mammals, right? Because we take care of our children. And so there's a strong maternal streak in men. And some men are very maternal. And some men are more maternal than many women. There's overlap between the sexes. But that doesn't matter. On average, women are still more agreeable than men. And so there's this proclivity to view the world through this maternal lens as infant. And that's all the, identity groups that are hypothetically being oppressed, and predator, and that's all the oppressors. And then the disgust layers on top of that, because predators are not only something to be afraid of, but also something to be disgusted by. And like evolutionarily speaking, we've developed very strong disgust responses to all sorts of predator categories, especially the more reptilian predators like snakes. And snakes have an odor that, especially when they use their defensive, some snakes exude a substance defensively that smells absolutely horrible to human beings, absolutely appallingly disgusting and horrible. And so predator is something to be afraid of, but also something to be disgusted by. And so for the social justice warrior who's motivated by maternal behavior and by disgust, if you're an offensive person, then you're basically a disgusting predator. And, there's nothing that's too awful as a punishment for a disgusting predator.
Well, just to bring back to the anecdote that sort of sparked this digression, which was your experience being set up, basically, as you said, to fail at these virtue signaling, making sure to refer to what was a person who was presenting as a woman as they. I think that this is actually, they are creating these individuals who are higher on disgust and disgust-based thinking, who can navigate these social situations really quickly, are actually creating a hierarchy with themselves on top, and people who think, aren't disgust-based thinkers, like more libertarian. Libertarians were low on disgust, so, but have this more rational, more methodical, let's look at this information and this information. Let's weigh this fact. Let's weigh this statistic.
You're talking about autists, Allison.
Yeah, I don't think we're all autists, but just people who are much more methodical in their thinking. But what this what these virtue signaling situations do, is it creates a social hierarchy with people who use the disgust filter to navigate the social situation really quickly. So they know, like they can, using their filter, they know when they're about to make a mistake, like referring to someone who's requested to be referred to as they, as she. So they can avoid that much easier than people who are more methodical and have to integrate more information. And it's creating a hierarchy.
Yeah, well, that's part of the advantage of the virtue signaling. And then there's an underground advantage to that too, which is, you could say, well, there's a certain amount of appropriateness in defending your infants from predators, and then there's a certain amount of appropriateness in using that metaphor, defensive victim versus predator, as a partial explanation for the sociological landscape. But then there's the underground element that the psychoanalyst would point out, which is that it's to the degree that you're a resentful and bitter person and you're looking for a place to dispose of some of your hatred, if you can rapidly divide the world up into victim and perpetrator, then you have every reason in the world to vent all your hatred and frustration on the hypothetical perpetrator. That's also extraordinarily convenient for you, and that's when things really get out of hand. It's when the darkness that's in the heart of a theoretically compassionate person, comes out as predator hunter at every opportunity, because, well, you get the underground motivation, which is I'm full of hatred, combined with the surface motivation, which is, well, I'm acting in everybody's best interest, to produce unbelievable justification for punitiveness. And I also see Bill C-16 and the accompanying laws as extraordinarily punitive. I mean, the tribunals that are set up to enforce these laws have already put themselves outside the common the common tradition of common law. And they say that right in their documents. So there's a document that describes the powers that the social justice tribunals have in Ontario, and there are terrifying things in that document. So one of the things, they ascribe to themselves the right to suspend normative jurisprudential and adversarial procedure when pursuing their social justice aims. It's written right into the powers. And they also have another clause, which is 1.7W under powers, that says that the tribunal can come up with any policy it wants to further its efficient pursuit of its aims. It's written right into the policies. And so these laws are disgust-based. They're motivated by resentment and the desire to attain power, and they're extraordinarily punitive. And they write this appalling conception of identity into the Canadian legal system. It's really not good.
Well, it's not. It's not just. It's definitely not good. It's also like, when I look at this, I'm a person who, I have problems with pronouns as they are. Like, I know that people who I work with, they know that I have this tendency to say she or he incorrectly, and unintentionally.
Well, it's off to jail for you.
Yeah, I know. It's and
a good thing too.
And it's like, and it's just because there's certain flags that I miss that other people don't miss. So essentially, what I see rising up is an authoritarian system with its sights set on people like me, who don't navigate these social situations as well, because I don't have as strong a disgust filter as these individuals. So I know I'm going to be making huge mistakes in the virtue signaling, and that's going to end up in a very bad place for me. And they're rising up the power to persecute people like myself.
Well, one of the things I found really fascinating was, at the same time, the PC authoritarians that I was debating with kept claiming that these laws were nowhere near as pernicious as they actually are. If I ever pushed them a little bit, then they would immediately show that I was correct in my, let's call them, paranoid suppositions. So, for example, I was on a TV program, TV Ontario. It's The Agenda with Steve Paikin, and we were talking about pronouns and gender identity. And there was a professor on there whose name is Nicholas Matt, and he said a couple of infamous things. But the first thing he said was that the scientific consensus
is a social construct.
Yes, he said sex. That's right. He said that there's no evidence that there's biological difference between men and women, and that's the scientific consensus. And that was just, both of those statements were mind-boggling. I mean, the first one is, it just renders you speechless. And the second one is, well, that is certainly not the scientific consensus. It's such an absurd statement that, but it shows you how viciously these people are going to go after the biologists, because obviously if that's the scientific consensus, then you have what are they going to be? Sociological deniers, like the climate deniers, something like that. But then, I kind of pushed him at one point to define what he thought I was doing, and he said I was abusing my students, and then I think Steve Paikin asked him if he thought that was violent, and he said yes. And I said, well, do you think that's abuse? Do you think it's violent abuse? And he said yes. And so, like, he would jump from misgendering to violent abuse in a second. And I talked to a friend of mine about that. He's a very thoughtful person, and he said, well, there's a really horrible underground thing going on there too, because if the radical left is able to put forward their proposition that misspeaking is equivalent to physical violence, then that justifies the use of physical violence in pushing back against speech, and that's part of the motivation for producing that landscape of ideas. If your speech is equivalent to violence, then I'm justified in using violence to quote, defend myself. And then during the U of T debate, Mary Bryson also accused me of disseminating hate propaganda. And so the idea that these laws will be used to silence people who have opinions that are offensive, let's say, which is pretty much anybody's opinion that I don't agree with, when it comes down to the definitions. The probability that these laws are going to be used by people who are even more censorious than the people who originated them is 100%.
Well, you look too at the, you see articles every now and then popping up, I'm a liberal professor and I'm terrified of my liberal students.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and our research shows why that is that there are actually two camps of people.
Yeah. The liberal professors were the compassionate, politically correct who, and they're not the authoritarians, yet they have kind of blindly, without any foresight whatsoever or understanding of any potential consequences, been indoctrinating all of these students who have more authoritarian personalities in this doctrine, in this set of ideas, and essentially saying this is the right way to think, and now look what they're reaping.
That's exactly right. Well, I don't know if you saw what happened at Ryerson a week ago, but this the guy who's the director of social work, and social work is gone. I mean, social work is so politically correct and so authoritarian that it's almost impossible to describe. I mean, the only discipline that's worse is women's studies, I would say.
I was actually talking to a man who was about 50, and he was retraining after an injury at work, and he said he was taking social work at the University of Ottawa or something, and he said, all I'm doing is I'm just keeping my head down, and I am not saying anything, and I am just going to tell them what they want to hear until I get through the program and get my degree, and then maybe I can make some change, slowly but surely, in how things are done. But I mean, like, he's absolutely, he feels like he's an alien.
Oh yeah.
Style kind of environment.
Oh yeah. Well, and the problem with his theory is that, like, if you keep your head down long enough and quiet, then you train yourself to keep your head down and be quiet, and you get really good at that, and you don't make changes later. That doesn't happen. And I see that with faculty members all the time. They say, well, I'd speak out, but I still haven't got tenure. And then after they get tenure, they say, well, I'd speak out, but I still haven't got my promotion to full professor, and they don't speak out. And then by the time they're full professor, they've spent 10 years training themselves to be silent little obedient sheep, and it's not like they're going to turn into a ravening wolf instantaneously. It's like that's all gone. You become what you practice.
Yeah, your amygdala has changed. Yeah.
Yeah, well, what happened at Ryerson a week ago was that the director of social work, so this is what happened, a black female assistant professor candidate came in to do a job talk, and that just means, she's up in front of about 40, 50 people maybe, describing her research, and sometime during her job talk he walked out, and who knows why, maybe he had to go answer the phone, or who knows, the story didn't include that detail, but the Black Liberation Collective jumped all over him and called him a racist and a gynophobe, I think that was the word, and a misogynoir, which is apparently you're misogynist against black women in particular, and really took him to task, and he resigned. And that's a perfect example of someone who's a PC liberal who was eaten by his own children, these horrible authoritarians.
I just want to interject for a second and just make an observation. This is more than the authoritarian PC or the authoritarian left creating creating a system in which you have a different opinion. They're actually creating a new axis of discrimination and bigotry. And the axis of discrimination and bigotry that they're creating is disgust-based thinkers versus non-disgust-based thinkers. Like, I can't. You put me in that situation you were in, I know I would screw up because I don't have that ability. So they're literally taking taking people who do not have the abilities required to navigate their social signaling, and they're casting them in the role of villain. I mean,
you could say that it's also, they're taking people who've transcended that, because one of the things that we've found is that lower intelligence is actually associated with higher disgust sensitivity.
Yeah.
So
and it's also, like, it reminds, what you're saying, Alison, reminds me of when I was on the agenda with Steve Paikin talking about white privilege and microaggressions. And there was this woman in tech who's very conventionally attractive, very socially adept. And she was there complaining about how, this male-dominated industry of tech, that the men in that industry are microaggressing against her all the time because they're not making her feel welcomed and they're not making her feel comfortable. And I'm thinking, okay, I know computer scientists, I know engineers. They are very awkward. Attractive, they are, half of them are autists, right? So she's literally going into a room full of people in wheelchairs and saying, your wheelchairs are making me feel uncomfortable, and you are a bad person.
Yeah, well, there's literature coming out from Baron Cohen's lab in England, and he's looking at, so one of the big differences between men and women, one of the biggest differences is that men have a proclivity to be interested in things and women have a proclivity to be interested in people. And you see this even in toy preference in very young children. So the boys will gravitate towards things like trucks and things with wheels, and the girls will gravitate towards dolls. And you even see that in chimpanzees, by the way, weirdly enough. And Baron Cohen has been trying to understand that fundamental difference. And what he's found is that testosterone exposure in utero is one of the factors that determines interest in things. So male fetuses that are exposed to more testosterone in utero end up being more interested in gadgets. And that's where the engineer types come from. And it's kind of a zero-sum game. It seems that your intelligence can be tuned towards the social domain, or your intelligence can be tuned towards the thing domain. And of course, as you pointed out, all those engineer types, they're really attuned to the thing domain, and a lot of their prejudice, so to speak, is just lack of sophistication and awkwardness.
Exactly.
I mean, and they're kind of blunt, and they're kind of disagreeable, and they're really interested in how things work. They're very methodical thinkers, and they're not that great at social. I mean, one time I was in this bar in California. I go down to California quite often, and it was in Palo Alto, and I was in there with two kind of techie types, really smart guys. And there was this woman at the bar who was a teacher, and she was obviously looking for a conversation and was lonesome looking for a conversation. And there was us three guys were sitting at the bar and her, and she kept trying to enter the conversation. And these two damn engineers, every time she'd enter the conversation, they would immediately start an argument with her and get all hyper rational. And then she'd sort of bounce off the conversation, and then, she'd try another social gambit, and they'd like get all logical at her and bounce her off the conversation again. I mean, I found it extremely comical because, there's this horrible stereotype of engineers that they have a hard time relating to people of the opposite sex. You see that in Dilbert cartoons all the time, and this was a perfect real life example of that. But the problem with this, especially, and this is going to happen in spades now that these damn sexual harassment policies, the universities have been forced to develop very elaborate sexual harassment policies by Kathleen Wynne's government, because of course they're obsessed by rape culture as long as it is in the West and not in Saudi Arabia, let's say. But the universities and colleges have been forced to develop these extremely punitive sexual harassment policies and to implement quasi-judicial proceedings within themselves as institutions. And this sort of thing that you just described is just going to become unbelievably common, where, dopey, thing-oriented guys are going to make stupid, unsophisticated errors in their communication with hypersensitive, personality disordered, social justice warriors in the vicinity. And, the universities are going to be flooded by complaints, and they're going to have to take on the burden of being the judiciary, in the absence of any real rule of law.
And they've eliminated the mens rea component. It is all actus reus is not an actual act. The wrongful act is the outcome. The outcome,
exactly.
And mens rea is no longer intent is no longer a consideration.
No, and that's grounded deeply in to my way of thinking, that's grounded deeply in the anti-patriarchy theories of the PC authoritarians, because part of English common law structure is part of the foundation of the patriarchy, and obviously that puts women who've being sexually assaulted at risk in an unfair way. And so obviously the thing to do with that is to throw out the entire English common law tradition. And who cares anyways, because it's just part of the corrupt patriarchy.
Oh, I would ask you to please use the appropriate term for that. It is the cis heteronormative white supremacist capitalist patriarchy.
Yeah, right, exactly. Well, and so then why have any respect for any of its presuppositions when you can replace that with equality of outcome and with consequence? I can't believe that they're replacing intent with consequence. I mean, that reverses like 6,000 years of civilization.
I don't know if you watched Janice Fiamengo's channel, but she actually was talking about a Supreme Court decision in 2013, I believe, that upheld a Human Rights Council decision wherein they said that the speech in question, in order to classify as prohibited speech, intent was not a factor. The repulsiveness of the speech was not a factor. What was a factor? The only and even whether the speech caused harm, not a factor. But the deciding factor was whether there was a likelihood that the speech may cause harm. Now, if you've ever read a legal contract, right, and you understand, legalese, and you're like, this is convoluted and cumbersome and really difficult to get through. And the reason for that is because every single term used in a contract is very specifically defined, right? And yet they are waving around in a Supreme Court decision vague concepts like likelihood that they haven't bothered to define or quantify, may cause harm. They haven't defined may or harm or cause, like they have all of this is just so vague and nebulous and open to interpretation and open to whatever judges' prejudices might be at the time.
Well, and soon the judges will be replaced too, because the federal government decided now that if you're applying for a judiciary position, that you have to produce a dossier that documents your ethnic identity, and then the committee that's going to select you will have had to undergo anti-racism and anti-bias training. That was announced about 3 weeks ago.
Give it 5 years, and that will be they will add. How did you vote in the last 5 federal elections?
Yeah, right. Well, if you look at the policy statements in the Ontario Human Rights Commission website, you find that all of the things that you just described that you're concerned about, that's written right into the law. I mean, the harassment policies, for example, if you're harassing someone, that's all defined by the subjective consequences of your words. And, your employer is responsible as well as you for the unintended consequences of your words, just as if your employer is the one uttering the words. And so it can be accidental, non-intended. You don't even have to know about it if you're the employer to be liable. And as I said, the consequences can be unintended. And so the law couldn't possibly be written to be more vague and more comprehensive and more punitive than it is.
I just received in the mail, I don't know if anybody else who's a Canadian listening to this or either Karen or you, Jordan, received this, a postcard telling us to go to this website to see how our political opinions line up with the average Canadian. And I was reading this and I'm like, wow, this is Orwellian. How our political opinions line up with the average. That is totally using social force to try to enforce conformity. And when my husband
who sent it?
The Canadian government. It was a postcard saying,
wow. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it was saying, go to this website, canadapolitics.com or something, to see how your opinion lines up with that of the average Canadian. I'm like, how my opinion lines up. So you're creating this social force to enforce conformity. And then when my husband tried to access the website, he couldn't. It actually was just completely blank. And he was like, why is this blank? And then he realized that because he has a whole bunch of programs that prevent tracking, the entire website was tracking like your location, your information, and he didn't access it. He couldn't access it because the tracker programs are preventing him from accessing it. The anti-tracking programs. So it's like they have this website where you can go and see how your opinions line up with that of all Canadians, which I assume is very appealing to disgust-based thinkers because they want to make sure that
the terminology is also very interesting. Line up, because they could have said compare or contrast but line up is, there's a metaphor there.
It might have been compare or a contrast. I don't want to get.
Okay.
But it is interesting that they would put it out like that, so that this is the popular opinion. How does your opinion compare to the popular opinion, or contrast with it, or line up with it? I don't know the exact verb, so I wouldn't want to be misleading. But
one thing that I have found very gratifying as a consequence of being embroiled in all of this is that I've received several thousands of letters now, and the bulk of the letter writers, I would say, the vast majority of the letter writers have been favorable to my position. So.
Okay, I know Brian wants to ask one question, so why don't you get in there with your question?
Yeah, sure. Around this discussion with the controversy that you've been caught up in, there are a lot of people who have been discussing it, and many people, and this is even before this happened to you, because we've been talking about social justice warriors for a while now, and many people have made sympathetic arguments for SJWs being very well-intentioned. And I wanted to know, because I think you have...
Yeah, well, I don't trust good intentions.
Yeah, so I wanted to get your opinion on that.
Well, I think that people often think that people often represent themselves, even to themselves, as well-intentioned, but that doesn't mean that they are. It's really hard to be well-intentioned, and first of all, I mean, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, as everyone knows, but my sense is that people in general are just as likely to be perpetrators as victims, let's say, in any given state of conflict. And unless you recognize in yourself the capacity to be a perpetrator, and you deeply recognize that, in which case you cease to assume that you necessarily hold the moral high ground, then the probability that you have good intentions is zero, because you don't regard yourself as a loaded weapon, and you are a loaded weapon. And one thing I've learned from studying totalitarianism is that the bulk of the evils that were committed by the Nazis and the Soviets were committed by ordinary, well-intentioned people. Now, I mean, they also pulled all sorts of malevolent psychopaths into their little pack of carnivores, but you can't blame the awful outcomes of Nazism and of the Soviet Union on obedience to orders, and you can't blame it on the acts of a small handful of malevolent people. It's the dangers that are in the heart of every single individual, and the whole good intention thing is, I think that's just, if you believe that you're motivated by nothing but good intentions, then you're naive to the point of dangerousness.
I think this is a really good place to transition into the after show. And thank you, Jordan, for joining us for the broadcast. And it's been very insightful. In the after show, I'm hoping that you might stay so I can explain some of the stuff that I've been thinking about within the relation between gender, authoritarianism, and the hero, victim, villain triad. Yeah, and how that all relates to Disgust. But I think this is a good place for us to end the public broadcast. And if you're interested in joining us in the patron-only after show, mosey on over to www.patreon.com/honeybadgerradio and become a patron, and you'll get access to the after show content. And Brian, can you take us out?
Yes.
In your your wet-nosed highness.
Thank you.
Yes.
Can you take
His preferred pronoun.
Yes. You better use them, otherwise I'm going to sue you.
Oh, wait. It's his glorious furry majesty's preferred pronoun.
Okay, yes. His glory,
right.
It's Fury Majesty.
Yes, well, get those pronouns right.
Or else.
Or else.